Good evening. My name is Nancy Keegan-Smith, and I welcome you as president of FLAIR from the cherry blossom capital. And let's remember the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. are due to two first ladies. Helen Taft got them, and Lady Bird Johnson got additional cherry trees, and they are so beautiful. I am very excited about our panel tonight and our topic. I'm also very excited about two upcoming FLAIR in-person conferences that I'd like to just remind you of. The first is the pre-conference in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with Central States Communication Association and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and Library. It is on the morning of April 3rd. It's called First Ladies Then and Now, Communicating Their Message, which traces the development of First Ladies studies from the historic 1984 First Ladies Conference convened by Betty Ford at the Ford Museum. There is more information at flair-net.org. The second conference is with FLAIR, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and American University School of Public Affairs. It is a conference also in Grand Rapids on the afternoon of April 26th. It is open to the public and is celebrating Betty Ford's 50th anniversary as First Lady and the 1984 conference that she planned at the Ford Museum, which furthered First Lady studies, and it will include actual audiovisual segments from the original conference that have not been seen in the last 40 years. The conferees also have the ability to attend the Betty Ford birthday luncheon by buying a ticket at a FLAIR discount featuring a special surprise program. We will post information on this second conference on our webpage next week, but feel free to email me for more information if you like. I would like to thank our partners and institutional members without whom we could not do these programs. I want to thank our partner, American University School of Public Affairs, and our FLAIR lifetime institutional members, including Rider University, White House Historical Association, Massachusetts Historical Society, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the George W. Bush Institute, the Center for Presidential History of SMU, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Dole Institute of Politics, and our newest lifetime institutional member, the National Archives and Records Administration. Our collaborative projects with our lifetime institutional members, along with our FLAIR lifetime individual members like East Wing, and all our FLAIR members are illustrative of the important relationships that FLAIR forms with its members in fulfilling its mission to promote research, education, and knowledge about U.S. First Ladies and their important legacies. FLAIR members are vital to FLAIR's continued success, so I want to thank all FLAIR members for your belief, support, and collaboration in our mission. Tonight's program is on the fascinating and little explored topic of sickness in the White House First Ladies, illnesses from 1840s to the 1980s. I would now like to turn the program over to the FLAIR Vice President and very competent, my friend, Diana Carlin, to moderate on what I know will be a very interesting program, and I look forward to listening to it. Thank you.
All right, everybody's here. I love it when technology works. Good evening. And as Nancy said, I'm Diana Carlin. I am the Vice President of FLAIR. And I'm really pleased to have a great panel with me tonight to talk about this subject. Let me just kind of briefly introduce. I'm going to kind of go around my circle of how I'm seeing everybody. But Michelle Gillen, who is at the National First Ladies Library in Canton, Ohio, and they are, as Nancy said, one of our institutional partners. Catherine, who we all know as Katie Sibley, is a professor at St. Joe's in Philadelphia. Elizabeth Thacker Estrada and she's here in her setting, librarian in California, and is a lifetime Flair member. Elizabeth has written on a lot of the antebellum First Ladies. So we have a great group. We cover the territory from the beginning of the country to now by the time we finish the program. So let me start with, in 2006, J.W. Murphy wrote a book called What Ails the White House? The Medical History of the Presidency. And the book is described as the presidency has fascinated readers since George Washington, but less widely known as the medical history of these great men. This book is the result of years of research with compelling stories of the injuries, illnesses, and untimely deaths of our nation's leaders. The chapters explore the impact presidential health had on the president, his family, his nation, and ultimately the world. Well, as First Lady scholars, we believe the same can be said of First Ladies. And this program was Katie Sibley's idea. So, Katie, I'm going to throw the first question to you. You've written about a First Lady who had a major health episode, and you're going to talk about that in more detail later, and was really the catalyst for the program. So can you provide a brief overview of why the First Lady's health also affects the president, his family, the nation, and potentially the world?
I'll be happy to. May I have the first slide, please? Thank you so much. So let me first introduce Florence. You can see her here in this portrait. This is the very first day of their administration, March 4th. Remember that's when the presidency started in those days. Happens to be my mother's birthday, just saying. March 4th, 1921. And you can see Florence and Warren on the right. And I'm sorry, on the left, your left, and of course Grace and her man Calvin on the right. And if you look at Calvin's feet, you can see that it is on a grate. That may be a little bit of a harbinger. I'm sorry about that. A harbinger of what may be coming, because her husband would die in office. That's Warren at age 57 of a heart attack. And the Coolidges, of course, would suffer a horrible tragedy. They would lose their teenage son in 1927 when he had an infection from a tennis game that infected his foot. She, of course, suffered from nephritis through much of her adult life, and she would die shortly after they left the White House. So at 60 in 1924. Now, you may get the sense that death came frequently a century ago, and you would be right. More broadly, though, First Lady's strength, mental and physical, has been closely related to their husbands' abilities to do their job. No surprise. And as Diana introduced us today, we got the sense how important the presidents were. But let's be clear, the First Ladies and their health is supremely important. Now, in addition to their own health issues, which we'll be talking about tonight, there also was their health advocacy. And this is a really key point, I think, because many of them were involved in health concerns. And you're going to hear about a number of these tonight. May I have the next slide, please? So just this month, we saw Jill Biden join her husband right here in what I think, and Myra Guten has confirmed this, who's very expert about precedents. This was probably the first time that a president and first lady together introduced an initiative. This is the president's new initiative, and I should say the first lady's too, on women's health, a $200 million project, or at least that's just the beginning of it. Now, other first ladies also had health interests, Betty Ford, and breast cancer. Next slide, please. This was an illness that Betty Ford suffered, as you probably are aware, but she also worked to alert others about. So it became part of her advocacy, part of her message. And you probably know, many of you, that she got thousands of letters about this, which you can still find, some online and some in the archive there in Grand Rapids, I think. So she did this as well after she left the White House for other ailments. May I have the next slide, please? Here she is. I love this picture because she was unabashed in her advocacy for women. She spoke out for the ERA. She spoke out for so many things, for the right of her daughters and sons to smoke marijuana, whatever it was. She spoke up about it. Now, when she revealed, though, her addiction, in addition to the breast cancer, which she revealed in the White House, after she left the White House, she revealed her addiction to alcohol and drugs, which, of course, had affected her throughout her life as a presidential spouse, but also as a congressional spouse. And she shared this with people, and she inspired them and set up this institution, which continues to this day in a number of branches to help people. Now, I'll give you another example. If we can look at the next slide, you'll see Rosalynn Carter, who had long been interested in mental health and became an advocate about that. And again, in her case, this was a family connection. There were people in her family and in Jimmy's family with mental health issues. And of course, here's Michelle Obama, who in her own family had seen her children, because she was so busy as a working mother and her husband was away at the State's house in Illinois. Her children were not eating very good food. And she saw this. And when she came to the White House, had a little more time to take care of them, she made sure that they had healthy food. Of course, she did before that too, but she wanted to make sure that not only they had healthy food, but other people did as well, as you can see in her garden here. So along with raising awareness, as all these last few women have done, you will also notice that these women were also very, very ill, some of them very ill. Just let's go back now to before Florence. And if I can see the next slide, you'll see Nellie Taft. Now, very sad, she came into the White House as an activist. She had already spoken up on behalf of working women. She had gone to factories. She'd spoken up about working women in the Washington bureaucracy. She was the first lady to ride with her husband to the inauguration. And yet she struck with a stroke early on. So then she's like voiceless after that for quite some time. But the cherry blossoms had been planted, thankfully. Nancy, right? Thank you for drawing those to our attention. Now, one more first lady I want to mention to you who was deathly, deathly ill. Next slide, please. This is Ellen Wilson, who, of course, did not live, unlike Nellie, who survived her time in the White House. Ellen did not. She was there for only a short time, year and a few months, and she died of Bright's disease. And as you can see, she was still an activist on behalf of working people and also the urban poor, in particularly African Americans in Washington. And on her deathbed, Congress passed the Alley Bill, although it was never probably adequately funded. But now we're going to look at some earlier first ladies who also had illnesses because, of course, in the 19th century, the health system was even much, much worse, and health knowledge was much worse. So I'm going to now turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, Elizabeth, my question for you, and Katie, thank you. I think you have shown that we need a book about what ails the White House with the first ladies. You've made the point, so thank you. Many of those early 19th century, especially antebellum first ladies, had, as Katie said, had health problems. And the first incident of a first lady dying in the White House occurred in 1842. So can you give us a little historical perspective on the early 19th century first ladies who had these health issues, and how did they deal with them?
First of all, I want to thank Flair for hosting this discussion about first ladies and illnesses, and I want to thank Katie for the segue into this topic. I'll be speaking about a few first ladies of the early 19th century. They've been viewed as invalids, and they've often also been viewed as unimportant to their husbands' administrations. Frequently, their historic reputations have been hurt by the fact that so much of their correspondence has been lost. Often, first ladies of the era weren't mentioned in government documents. They often weren't covered by newspapers and periodicals of the time. And a few of these first ladies, their husbands' administrations were very short or quite controversial. Some have been accused of malingering, and all have, while suffering from illness, had women relatives who acted as White House hostesses on their behalf. Yet all were more active than previously assumed, and in this brief presentation, I will mention at least one positive action of each First Lady. I begin with Elizabeth Monroe, who was a forerunner of the invalid First Ladies of the 1840s and 1850s. She was born in New York in 1768. She married Congressman James Monroe in 1786. As the wife of the U.S. minister in France during the French Revolution, she played a public role in rescuing the wife of the Marquis de Lafayette from prison and the guillotine. She rode in the American embassy carriage to the prison where Adrienne de Lafayette was being held, and she visited the captive because of the interest that Elizabeth, and by extension the United States, showed in regarding the welfare of Adrienne de Lafayette. She was released from prison by the French government on January 22nd, 1795. So Elizabeth had proven that the wife of a public official could exert important, albeit unofficial, influence. Between December 1786 and April 1802, Elizabeth became the mother of 2 girls and a boy. After her only son died in 1800, she began having what appeared to be epileptic seizures, shaking and falling unconscious, and this illness was then known as the falling sickness. After Elizabeth became First Lady in 1817, the public did not know that she suffered from this illness, and there was a widespread assumption at the time that the falling sickness was a form of mental illness. So, of course, the Monroes were reluctant to disclose details about Elizabeth's health. Finding the popular and outgoing and legendary White House hostess Dolly Madison a very tough act to follow, Elizabeth established a European-style and less democratic protocol in stark contrast to the practices of her predecessor. She would neither make calls nor return the formal call, which is a visit that signified status and recognition from the executive branch, to the wives of judicial and legislative officials, as well as those of the foreign diplomatic corps. But the presence of a woman in the White House gave access to other women to the seat of executive power, and any restrictions to that access and to the access of the public in general was not welcome in Washington City, as Washington, D.C. was then known. And these restrictions became a political issue. President Monroe held a December 1817 cabinet meeting in which he explained the confusing rules of the new White House social policy, and to also discuss how the different department heads might create their own policies in regard to social interaction with foreign dignitaries. In January 1818, Elizabeth began her first winter social season as First Lady, and she sought and gained the support of European-born and educated Louisa Adams, the wife of the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and who would follow Elizabeth Monroe as First Lady. When the Monroes did not host the annual open house, public reception on Independence Day in 1819, even though citizens not among the city's elite were insulted. Dissatisfaction with Elizabeth Monroe's protocol led to a boycott of all administration receptions by officials in Washington. When Louisa Adams instituted the same social policy, her receptions were also boycotted. Finally, President Monroe held a second cabinet meeting in December 1819, in which it was decided that while the president's family would hold steadfast to their rules, the other executive branch officials and their families, the vice president and the individual cabinet members, were free to determine their own social policy. During James' second term, which was during a less partisan, quote unquote, era of good feelings, Elizabeth's policy was accepted and guests returned to the White House. When Elizabeth Monroe did appear at receptions and other events, the public found her to be a capable hostess, yet she was always accompanied and protected by a circle of her female relatives. Her eldest daughter, Eliza Monroe Hay, sometimes served as hostess. Elizabeth was in such poor health that she and her husband had to remain in the White House 3 weeks after his administration ended in 1825. A year after leaving the White House, Elizabeth suffered a seizure and collapsed near an open fireplace, sustaining severe burns. She died in 1830 in Virginia, age 62. Next slide, please. Letitia Christian was born in 1790 in Providence Forge, Virginia. She married John Tyler, who was then a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, in 1813. And she went on to become the mother of 7 surviving children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. In 1839, Letitia suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and too ill to move about easily. In 1840, the presidential ticket of Tippecanoe and Tyler II, William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, was elected. Harrison served as president only 1 month before dying in the White House, and Tyler became president on April 4th, 1841. Despite her physical limitations and deteriorating health, Letitia still managed to assume many of the duties traditionally performed by the president's wife, including directing the White House social calendar, greeting callers, and advising her husband on political affairs. Actress Priscilla Cooper Tyler, who had married the Tylers' eldest son, Robert, in 1839, assumed the majority of the hostessing responsibilities. Letitia's daughters, Elizabeth Tyler and Letitia Tyler Simple, would also serve as hostesses. Letitia suffered a second stroke and died in the White House on September 10, 1842, at the age of 51. In 1844, Julia Gardner married the widowed President Tyler and became the new White House hostess. Next slide, please. Margaret Smith was born in 1788 in Calvert County, Maryland. She married Lieutenant Zachary Taylor of the U.S. Army in 1810. For nearly 40 years, they led an itinerant Army life, living as far afield as the Michigan Territory, Louisiana, Indiana, and Florida. As Zachary said of Margaret, she was as much a soldier as I was. She became the mother of 6 children, 5 girls and 1 boy. In 1820, Margaret and 2 of her daughters contracted bilious fever in Bayou Sara, Louisiana. Margaret barely survived, but her 2 little girls, ages 3 and 1, died. The most common cause of this fever is malaria. In correspondence from that point on, Zachary would describe Margaret's health as delicate. Malaria, which is transmitted by mosquitoes, can cause long-term side effects, including kidney and liver damage, anemia, and low blood sugar. In June 1835, daughter Sarah married Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. The newlyweds traveled to his sister's plantation, Louisiana. Despite assuring her parents that, quote, the country is quite healthy, unquote, she and Jefferson became seriously ill from malaria, and she died just 3 months after their wedding. She died not far from where her young sisters had died 15 years earlier. In 1843 and 1844, Margaret gathered a group of Episcopalians to receive a charter of incorporations from the Louisiana legislature for St. James Church in Baton Rouge, and it's still an active church. In 1848, Margaret unsuccessfully prayed that her husband, who was by then a general and a hero of the Mexican-American War, would not be elected president. A reluctant first lady, she left most hostessing duties to her youngest daughter, Betty Taylor Bliss. President Taylor fell ill on the 4th of July, possibly with a stomach virus or illness from contaminated water, and he died on July 9th, 1850. The former first lady never spoke of the White House again. On August 14th, 1852, Margaret died of a fever at the age of 63 at the home of her daughter Betty in Mississippi. In 1862, the Taylor plantation fashion, which Zachary had purchased for his only son, Richard, who had become a Confederate general, was confiscated and emptied by Union troops, causing the loss of much Taylor documentation. In fact, there's some debate as to whether there is an actual likeness of Margaret Taylor in existence. Okay, thank you. Now, next slide, please. Abigail Powers was born on March 13th, 1798 in Stillwater, New York, and she became a school teacher in her teens. Following her marriage to then attorney Millard Fillmore in 1826, she continued to hold classes at her home, so she became the first lady to work for wages before and after marriage. The Fillmores became the parents of 1 son and 1 daughter. In 1848, Millard was elected vice president on the Whig ticket headed by Zachary Taylor. Abigail became first lady on July 9th, 1850, when Taylor died. And then the healthfulness, or rather the unhealthfulness, of the White House following the deaths of 2 presidents and 1 first lady within a decade became a matter of public comment, as well as a personal concern to the Fillmores. Prior to his family moving into the mansion, Millard made the White House more habitable by having the heating system enlarged and having the sewer system continued past the public grounds to the south of the White House, down 17th Street to the canal. On a more pleasant note, the Fillmores founded the White House Library and making the mansion even more congenial to the book-loving family. Abigail's hostessing duties as the president's wife were impeded by injury. She had broken bones in her foot and ankle from a serious fall in 1842 in Washington when Millard was serving in Congress. And as First Lady, she suffered another bad fall in the summer of 1851, which seriously re-injured the weak ankle. According to her biographer, Laura Holloway, She sometimes stayed in bed all day to rest the ankle so that she could endure the fatigue of the 2 hours she would be obliged to stand for the Friday evening receptions. Invariably described as an invalid during the administration of her husband, Mrs. Fillmore has usually been portrayed as turning over almost all or most of her hostessing duties to her daughter, Abby. What actually occurred in the Fillmore White House was a division of duties. Abigail regularly received callers and greeted visitors to the White House, while the duty of making calls and visiting others in their homes fell to her daughter. For instance, Abby visited the venerable Eliza Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, whom we all know from the musical. Because of Abigail's lameness and other health problems, Abby did occasionally stand in for her mother, literally stand in for her mother. During the course of the administration, the health of the First Lady would have public repercussions, involve Abigail Fillmore with two of the notable women of the age, mental health care reformer Dorothea Dix and author Susan Helen de Croft, and lead to one of her best-known charitable actions. The Fillmores supported the work of Dorothea Dix, culminating in the establishment of what became St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, the first federally operated psychiatric hospital in the United States. So you can consider Abigail Fillmore a forerunner of Rosalynn Carter and her interest in mental health. Abigail not only endured lameness, but she also suffered from ear problems. And in a letter Dorothea Dix wrote to her, the recommendation was made that Abigail see Dr. Joseph Turnbull, a doctor who'd recently arrived from London, who treated poor vision and hearing. Dr. Turnbull improved hearing by introducing into one ear an Aeolian pitch pipe or other properly adapted musical instrument and continuing the vibration within the ear for the space of 5 or 10 minutes daily. He may also have applied vibration to the eyes to improve vision. In March 1852, Abigail was treated by Dr. Turnbull and returned to Washington with improved hearing. Although the wife of the president in this era did not take public stands on the issues of the day, she could and did act on behalf of specific individuals. Abigail had formed a close friendship with the author Susan Helen de Croft, known as the blind authoress, and a native of Abigail's home state of New York. That March, Abigail wrote to de Croft to tell her about the wonders Dr. Turnbull was performing for people with deafness and blindness. De Croft visited the doctor in New York and in New Orleans, gaining the ability to distinguish her friends. Thrilled with the improvement in her vision, she wrote an open and effusive letter that was published in the New Orleans Daily Delta, in which she thanked, quote, President Fillmore's lady, unquote, for arranging for her care. The published letter prompted others to write to the Fillmores requesting information and referrals. One man wrote to President Fillmore on behalf of his son who'd been blinded by a shot in the face, and a woman wrote to Mrs. Fillmore seeking relief for a terrible deafness. The woman appealed to Abigail as she had, quote, many times heard of the high nobility of your nature, as well as your kindness toward and sympathy for the afflicted, unquote. Having suffered from respiratory problems during her adulthood, Abigail died of pneumonia on March 30th, 1853, less than a month after leaving the White House. In a letter of April 4th to a friend, author Washington Irving reflected, quote, you have no doubt been shocked like myself at the sad bereavement which has afflicted the worthy Fillmore family. I almost think poor Mrs. Fillmore must have received her death warrant while standing by my side on the marble terrace of the Capitol, exposed to chilly wind and snow, listening to the inaugural speech of her husband's successor, unquote. In a letter to her sister, the new and grieving First Lady, Jane Pierce, linked Abigail's death to the presidency. Quote, Mrs. Fillmore died very suddenly at last. She had been ill but about 3 weeks and was usually well and large and robust in appearance. Fatality seems connected with the occupants of this office and this mansion. Next slide, please. Jane means Appleton was born in 1806 in Hampton, New Hampshire. She married Franklin Pierce in 1834 in Amherst, New Hampshire. She experienced a lifetime of bad health, including tuberculosis. She was small and underweight in an era in which the clothing a woman wore, including voluminous skirts, might weigh 30 pounds. Still, she was able to bear 3 sons, Franklin Pierce Jr., who was born February 1836 in New Hampshire, and died, unfortunately, just 3 days later before his father, who was then serving in the U.S. Congress in Washington, could see him alive. Their next son, Frank Robert Pierce, was born in August 1839, but died at the age of 4 of epidemic typhus. Their third son, Benjamin Pierce, was born in 1841 in Concord, New Hampshire. Jane was another reluctant First Lady who unsuccessfully prayed that her husband would not be elected to the presidency. But Franklin prevailed in the presidential general election in November 1852. On January 6, 1853, the president-elect and his wife saw their sole surviving son, Benjamin, maimed and killed in a train accident from which both escaped without serious injury. Overcome by grief, Jane did not attend her husband's March 4th inauguration. In mourning, Jane did not receive publicly at the White House until January 1855, having asked her uncle Robert Means' widow, Abigail Kent Means, to perform the official duties of the First Lady. When Mrs. Means was absent from the Capitol, Mrs. Jefferson Davis, Bryna Howell Davis, the future First Lady of the Confederacy and the second wife of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, would officiate, as did other cabinet wives. During the conflict over slavery in Bleeding, Kansas, Jane Pierce interceded with her husband to free from prison Charles Robinson, the leader of the anti-slavery Free State settlers in Lawrence, Kansas, who had been indicted in 1856 for treason by pro-slavery courts. Dr. Robinson was in danger of being convicted and executed. Let's see. As a consequence of Jane's actions, Dr. Robinson was eventually freed. After leaving the White House in 1853, Jane continued to battle illness. In May 1859, for instance, she weighed just 85 pounds. She was 5'5", and fortunately, by 1860, she gained 15 pounds, which Franklin thought, quote, just balanced, unquote, her, and he wanted her to continue to gain weight. Jane Pierce died at her sister Mary Aiken's home in Andover, Massachusetts on December 2nd, 1863. She was 57 years old. Mrs. Robert E. Lee, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, wrote in a private letter, quote, I have known many of the ladies of the White House, none more truly excellent than the afflicted wife of President Pierce. Her health was a bar to any great effort on her part to meet the expectations of the public in her high position, but she was a refined, extremely religious and well-educated lady, unquote. As far as being malingerers or faking illness, the daughter of a doctor who cared for the inhabitants of the executive mansion in the antebellum years attested that Abigail Fillmore and Jane Pierce were in poor health. Virginia Miller recalled that her father, Dr. Thomas Miller, quote, was the physician called in when needed by occupants in the White House until Mr. Lincoln became president. I do not think there was much sickness in the White House except with Mr. Knox Walker's family, the family of President Polk's nephew, and Mrs. Fillmore and Mrs. Pierce, and of course, General Taylor. And that was a letter, statement read before this Columbia Historical Society, 1899. And thank you for listening about antebellum First Ladies. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And the Jane Pierce story, of course, really touches me because I live in Lawrence, and Charles Robinson gave the land for the University of Kansas, where I taught for 24 years. So thanks to Jane, our history is what it is, as opposed to what it might have been. So I think
Thank you.
Shown is how, even with illness, all of these women were able to do something to contribute. So Michelle, I'm going to turn to you now. Ida McKinley's home is right next to your office. And Ida's, unlike some of these other women from the antebellum period, Ida's illness was a lot more publicly known, and it actually became a campaign issue in 1896. So can you tell us how the McKinleys dealt with this and, what Ida did in spite of her illness?
Thank you. Thank you, Diana and Catherine and Elizabeth. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I love this, what Katie wanted to do. I think it's very, very vital because it does. The wife's illness affects the presidency, no doubt. And that was very, very true with Ida McKinley. By the time that President-elect McKinley became president, Ida had been suffering with seizures, epilepsy. We're not really sure what it was. She had times when she was totally fine and healthy, and other times when she was having a lot of seizures. She also had trouble walking. This all seemed to stem from having in 1874, I believe, is when her baby Ida died, and she was born sickly. It was a difficult pregnancy. Dr. Lud Depeche believes that she probably suffered from preeclampsia. And so that was what brought on these severe headaches, all of that. The baby's born ill and doesn't live. She lives about 4 months. And Ida is left with these seizures, or epilepsy, and problems with a weakened leg. By the time that he runs for president in 1816 or 1896, she's been dealing with these kinds of episodes for over 20 years by this point. So they kind of had their way that they dealt with it. Ida was always had been a very vital, strong-willed woman. And so to lose this was very hard on her. And she and President McKinley were very devoted to one another because of the loss of both of their children young. They compensated by living together in very in very tight quarters. They didn't need much space. When he was Congressman McKinley, they were living in a hotel, in a suite in a hotel in Washington. When they were living in, when he was governor, they were at the O'Neill House in Columbus. And they had suites in all these places. And when they were in Canton, where I am right now, they were living in Ida's ancestral home on the 3rd floor. So they always had these tight quarters. She was very much involved in the political scene with him. You had to if you were coming to see him, you had to say hi to Mrs. McKinley on your way to say hi to him. They were very, very devoted to one another. So when they're running for president, it's known that Ida McKinley has she's an invalid, and yet they want to prove that she is very involved, because she was. And so they do these wonderful things where they play up William McKinley's devotion to Ida and how he has to help her so much. Ida doesn't really care. As long as you vote for her husband, she'll do whatever you want. She'll be portrayed however is meaningful to help him get elected. But that means that he's that she kind of comes off as being this very weak, very needy woman at times. During the campaign, they're campaigning in a rented house down the street from where they lived in Canton. And so it was really brilliant. They rent this house. The front porch campaign happens. People come to that house. They destroy the yard, they destroy the fence, they break the foundation of the porch. But when they need to get away, and when Ida is needing rest, they are living down the street on the 3rd floor of the Saxton House. Of course, the American people believe that that's Ida and William McKinley's house then, when they become president and first lady. And so they buy their very first house while they're president and first lady. They bought that campaign house to become a presidential site. It didn't work out that way. It got torn down during the Depression, and it was rotted away. So it's very sad, but that's kind of what they did. They did all these kind of marvelous things to play up that Ida was this very vital person, but actually it was to portray McKinley as a devoted man to his invalid wife. When they got into the White House, they changed some protocol ways to because Ida would do what she could as First Lady. She brought in her nieces if she was not well or needed to rest. She had nieces who on both sides, the McKinleys and the Barbers, her nieces there from her sister's side, they all would stand in and be White House hostesses for Ida. But as far as protocol, they changed, McKinley changed how he sat at presidential state dinners. He would sit at the front of the table, and normally the First Lady sat on the opposite side, on the other side of the table. But under the McKinleys, Ida sat next to him, so that if she had a seizure or an episode, all he would do is he'd just take a napkin or a handkerchief and throw it over her face. And from what people would say, there was like a hissing sound that would happen. And then as soon as she would have this episode, he'd just remove the cloth from her face, and they would continue on just as normal. And there were plenty of people who contemporaries who saw this happen, and Ida would be totally fine afterwards. She just almost didn't even remember that this had happened. But she continued to be who she was. She was a very strong, opinionated lady. She supported women's suffrage way before it was safe to do that. She actually welcomed Susan B. Anthony, gave her flowers, and Susan B. Anthony announced that these flowers were at that night at the convention, that these flowers for the women's suffrage group were from the First Lady who supported them. Ida made she had a doll made and dressed, as did Edith Roosevelt, that was auctioned off for a fundraiser for the women's suffrage movement, very, very actively supporting women's suffrage, which is very neat. She also knitted crocheted slippers, which became very prized possessions by people. Estimates are between 3,000 and 4,000 little slippers that she made. And she made, they were exquisitely made. She made all different sizes, and she gave them to friends, family, babies when babies were born. And she also gave them to people to help raise funds as fundraising. And they would bring a nice prize for people for their fundraisers. And so she enjoyed being able to do those things and took a lot of pride in it. Oh, Diana, you're muted.
Sorry, forgot to do that. So thank you very much, Michelle. Ida was definitely one of those change points where it became much more public about the First Lady, where the earlier women, it was people knew within the circles, but it wasn't as public. And Katie, when you did the kind of introduction to this, you mentioned Betty Ford bringing breast cancer, addiction out into the forefront. Nancy Reagan had an impact on that. Barbara Bush was very open about her thyroid situation. So we've had much more honesty, but Florence was really a turning point. So can you tell a little bit about Florence and how she handled her illness in the White House?
Oh, I will happily do that. Florence was a turning point in so many ways. I mean, after all, she made the cracks in the mold that Eleanor broke. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course. She made the cracks. Now, if I could have the first slide, I will just show you a sign of her openness. Okay, so this is really a leitmotif of the Harding administration, both Florence and Warren. They wanted to open up the grounds, right? Have the Easter egg roll, bring the American people to the White House, because their predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, Edith Wilson, of course, it was World War I, but it was also that Wilson, as you know, was very ill with a stroke during the last part of his administration. And one of the ways that they both kept people off the lawn and also helped the war effort, as you can see in the next slide, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story, is that they can you show the next slide? They had a flock of lovely little woolly creatures. And so this actually helped the lawn stay trim, and it created wool for the war, but it certainly wasn't very welcoming to the American people. But of course, that was fine with the Wilsons because they, had some issues going on inside they wanted to kind of keep under wraps. Well, Florence, total change of scenery. So inviting people in, but also if you can move to the next slide, you'll see that she really welcomed movie men. She welcomed Hollywood. She welcomed people who would document what she was doing. She loved photo ops. And by the way, she didn't mind trying some of them out herself. If you can show the next slide, you'll see some of these men massing to take a picture of her with these visiting Filipino delegates. These were women who came with their husbands. The husbands were trying, and the women too, to obtain independence for the Philippines. And they came and visited the White House. And Florence thought this was just a lovely occasion to take a lot of pretty pictures. And so she did exactly that. Now, one more slide, please. I'll just underline again her visibility, how she loved to be seen. How this is her with the Girl Scouts. We often think of the Girl Scouts with Lou Hoover, of course, but Florence was happy to invite them along as well. But as to get back really to Diana's point, I think I've made my case now for her openness and her willingness to be visible. Florence, as I mentioned earlier, had a very bad kidney ailment. This started to affect her very early on in her life. Really, she was married to Warren, but she had already a child with her first husband, who she broke away from him. They got divorced. Then she met Warren, but they never had any children of their own. Although we now know that Warren did have another child, but that's another story. We don't have to get into that now. But Florence never had any more children. And part of that was because, of this kidney ailment that got worse and worse. And so when she was in the White House, she had been dealing with this for quite some time. She had doctors she called on, but it hit her again in the fall of 1922. They had gone on a lovely tour on the Mayflower, the boat that they used, and other presidents as well. And so she came back very, very ill. And if you can show the next slide, you'll see this was her doctor, Dr. Charles Sawyer, excuse me, and his son as well, Carl Sawyer, who's pictured in the Dr. Sawyer sanitariums here. These were based back in Marion. So they've been looking after her there. And Charles Sawyer came to Washington and looked after her there. And of course, so did a man called Joel Boone, who I would argue is probably a better doctor. And when Florence got very, very ill in her in that late fall and into the spring, fall 22, spring of 23, Dr. Boone kept a marvelous diary of the treatment of her, which you can read. It's at the Library of Congress, probably online now for all I know. But I used it in my book. And it's just a fascinating story of a White House illness and how it was handled. And of course, Sawyer's part of the story as well. But what's key here is that she was open about it. She shared this. She wanted the country to know. If you come to the next slide, you'll see she doesn't look really herself here in this next picture. She's obviously, something is wrong here. She was usually very, very thin. Here she is with her friend Evelyn Walsh McLean. She's recovering. That's the woman, the Hope Diamond heiress, if you're interested. But one of the ways she recovered was she called in this man called Emile Coué. She believed in his method. It was a method of hypnotism, which she said, basically every day in every way, I'm getting better and better. You probably heard that mantra, but she really believed that mind over matter. And Boone recalled a time where she literally gripped his hands so tight while she was in the middle of this horrible kidney ailment, this nephritis. Remember, they had no dialysis. They didn't have treatment. They just had to sweat it out of her. It was horrible. She's in Washington. It's hot. She's sweating. She's gripping his hands so tight that his hands bled from her strength. She was just going to get better. And she called, this is like the really key point, she called on the country to help her. She wanted everyone to pray for her. She wanted the country to know she was ill. And she wanted to, she knew that would help her if people were praying and thinking of her. And she was using these methods, right, to get better. She did not want to hide it away at all. And of course, next slide, please. All the time hanging over her was this prediction of Madame Marcia, There's a very actually interesting article in East Wing magazine about Madame Marcia and her influence in the Washington official Washington in the early 1920s. Madame Marcia was a what we call her an astrologer, I guess, a psychic. Just like Nancy Reagan relied on a psychic, so did Florence. And what was hanging over Florence was that Warren was supposed to die in office, and she knew this and she believed this, but it did not stop her. She was determined. Once again, mind over matter. She was going to get through it. And even if he did die, that wasn't going to stop her from encouraging him to run. And so indeed he did and was elected. But everything that Madame Marcia predicted, including the day he was going to get nominated, et cetera, it all came true. It's amazing. So I don't know what you think about psychics, but it's quite incredible. Now, Florence did get better, as you'll see in the next slide. She came out. There she is, very, very thin again, but strong, making her first public appearance there with some of her staff on the porch. And then there was the opportunity that summer of 1923 to go to Alaska. And so she was very excited because she was well enough to go. But of course, Boone was worried that she might not survive. So they packed a coffin for her, a casket. I know that, Michelle, you wanted to show us a casket too, but I'm sorry you didn't have it. We could have had another casket. But she packed this casket. Well, she didn't know about it. But of course, who died on the way? Next slide, please. It was not Florence. There they are in the beautiful, gorgeous locale of Alaska, the first president and first lady to come to Alaska. And suddenly he gets very ill. Was it poison crab? No, it was probably maybe that exacerbated it. But in the end, he had a heart attack. If you see on the next slide, it happens very fast. He's dead. And of course, there were all kinds of rumors about what exactly happened. But the fact is, he had a heart attack and he died. But it was a shock because he seemed to be getting better just at that point. By then, they were in San Francisco. And so, of course, now she's got to arrange his funeral and carry him back across the country. You can see many, many people stopped to visit him. It was quite a moment. I mean, 96 hours of this funeral train. I know we've all heard about Abraham Lincoln's train. We've heard about Robert Kennedy's, and these are very important and very moving scenes. But let's not forget that Harding traveled all the way across the country, and thousands of people came, especially in Chicago. It was quite a moment. So just to kind of underline this then, in the next slide, you'll see what she had. The last funeral was this giant affair in Washington. And she had to arrange all these funerals in San Francisco, one in Ohio, one in Washington. And she got through it all. She said, I will not break down. It was that strength she had. But of course, what happens? He dies. As we know, he's already dead by now. And she wanted to live in Washington and have another life, but then she got sick again. And she went back to Marion. And of course, she didn't anymore seem to have that fire in her to stay alive. I don't know. Maybe this was a worse condition now. She died, sadly, in August of 1924. So succumbing to this ailment. So once again, a very sick first lady, and but one who had really struggled and been visible. And that, of course, sets the stage, I think, for later first ladies, as Diana has mentioned. We can think of Nancy Reagan. We can think of course, Betty Ford, but also Barbara Bush and others who are quite open about their ailments. So thank you for listening to Florence's story. Of course, I always love to tell it.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks to all of you. If any of you have questions, please put them in the comment section. We have about 5 more minutes. And if you have a question, put it in there and we'll cover it. While we're waiting for your questions, do any of you have any last thoughts about this? You know, it's often said that first ladies are mirrors of their times, but some of them also move the clock forward, or at least catch up with society. So in terms of illness and how it was dealt with, how do you think these women who you talked about either reflected or moved us forward? I think Florence is a good example of moving forward, Betty Ford. But anything about the others? Michelle?
I totally agree. I think that Florence, I'm really glad Katie brings Florence up. She doesn't get enough credit for so much of what she's such a groundbreaker herself. She suffers from her husband. But and I also think that I loved what Elizabeth was pointing out with how that was a stigma of mental illness by having epilepsy. And of course, that's Ida is suffering from that too. And yet, I like to see that. I see that where Elizabeth was trying to keep it so tight and be careful, that Ida at least was doing it when she could, and pretty. That seems amazing to me that they allowed them to have a handkerchief over. She would have this little episode in front of people. That's incredibly amazing for the times. You just didn't see people like that.
So, well, it appears there are no questions. Any last thoughts, Liz or Katie? And then I'm going to have Nancy come back once you two finish with any last thoughts.
With the first ladies of the 1840s and 1850s, they lived in the era of the cult of domesticity, and four major tenets of that were domesticity, submissiveness, purity, and piety. And it just seems like those first ladies were definitely adherents of that quote unquote cult, and that they seem to embody many of those virtues as well. And just this idea of separate spheres and women's places in the home, being invalids, that by necessity they had to stay home. So I think sort of their illnesses in a way fit their era, and they weren't seen publicly as much as, say, certainly not Florence Harding or Betty Ford, but they sort of fit the tenor of their times, I think.
And if I could just add, if you think about Florence, I mean, she was perhaps one of the first ladies, maybe she was the first to, well, no, Ellen Wilson, of course, sold her art. So, that's certainly earning her money. But Florence worked, of course, in the newspaper with her husband. So, she's someone who obviously is attuned to publicity and being open and sharing, and also as a working woman. So you can see kind of the path to today with Dr. Biden, who's obviously a working woman as well. And of course, so was Michelle Obama and others, although Dr. Biden's really the first, I think, to work in the White House. But I think that that combination of a working woman, and especially a woman who had been in the newspaper industry and living, of course, a time with suffrage, some of you talked about that, it really, I think, opened the door for Florence in a way that earlier it probably would have been more difficult for her to be as open about it. So she certainly benefited from those times and, of course, her life circumstances.
Well, thanks to all of you. This was very interesting. I know there's far more that could be said, just like with all of our other programs. But I want to turn this back to our FLAIR president, Nancy Keegan-Smith, for some final thoughts. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, panel. It was just fascinating. And I just want one thought, which is the power of the First Lady. You've heard it tonight. And then think of Betty Ford coming out and saying she had cancer at a time when cancer was whispered about and kept secret. So thank everyone for joining us tonight. We're excited about FLAIR's upcoming virtual programs, our first two in-person conferences, and the soon-to-be first edition of the e-journal. So please consult our website, flair-net.org. Watch our social media channels and email alerts for our exciting upcoming programming. And thank you for joining us.